tried to keep my focus on this page and my Instagram channel very narrow. So for the last 5 years, I've been trying to sound the alarm on judicial corruption in Chicago family courts, and also the issue of family court corruption globally, and also the issue of the global crisis in family courts. So I've thought the best strategy, because I'm fighting for my kids and for my life, or for a life that's worth living, which includes my kids. I've tried to just play down anything that might be controversial, tried to stay narrowly on topic. But I've changed that recently and started talking about other things, partly, as I said, anything to get people talking about my case, reading my case notes, digging into the court filings, and breaking this story open. But also, I just feel as a citizen, it's really important. I'm doing this channel to protect Angus and Teddy, my sons, but I know that I need to do what's necessary to keep myself safe for them and protect the country that they live in and make it a place that's safe for them and good for them. So there's been a lot of talk lately about a particular Twitch streamer, Hassan Piker, who some label as an extremist. Some people use words like dangerous and radical. And as somebody who I believe would be labeled as Antifa or socialist for positions I've held, positions I still hold, I believe it's important to point out that when you're living in a fascist regime, when you have a government that's building concentration camps, when you have people like Stephen Miller publicly saying that they want to lock up leftists like me and leftists like Hassan Piker, it is truly dangerous to not stand in solidarity with people who just want to exercise their free speech and vote as they wish. In other words, you need to be in solidarity with Americans, American citizens. And it's shocking to me that the country that I believe used to protect people like me, even when we're in the political minority, is increasingly becoming tolerant of talking about locking up dissidents. And since I'm already marginalized, I feel like I owe it to other people to be honest about my political identity and why I think it's important that people be allowed to have their beliefs. So first of all, like most people who would identify as leftist or progressive even or socialist, I don't regard Antifa as a real organization. I've never heard of an actual group called Antifa. I've never met anyone called Antifa. I do know a lot of people who are against fascism, and I am anti-fascist. But I was at a point radicalized, and I was never violent. I never associated with people who liked violence or planned violence or even vandalism, which some people would consider violence. But I was radical in that I was part of a group and believed in a position where I didn't believe in voting. I felt that the proletariat had to rise up and gain class consciousness. I honestly never thought about what that would look like or if people would be armed while they did it. I literally just thought people would just realize they wanted to be socialists. So for a lot of, like most people who become radicalized and decide that the two-party system or whatever electoral system isn't working for them, I was radicalized on a single issue. I really didn't have a class consciousness because I grew up in a pretty conservative town, just understanding that I liked Democrats like Kennedy, who my mom had grown up liking, and that was my team. I didn't really know. I knew about the progressive movement, so I knew about American history having different movements, but I didn't really think there were other options now. But I went to the Twin Cities, where I think people now realize there is a lot of political activism. and that's where I went for college. And when I went to a little liberal arts college called McAllister, I didn't realize that in the 80s, I went in the 90s, it was associated with the punk movement and especially leftist political punks. Actually, Jonathan Franzen has a book called Freedom that talks about that time and that movement. But that is kind of, I had this picture that my first year roommate, Jen, gave me that I carried it around as a totem for years because Jen and I were assigned together because we were cool kids, which meant we were smokers. Which, of course, we were the two working class kids whose mom were factory workers, and we were smokers and we were cool. And this was like, she was from Wisconsin, I'm from Michigan. They're very similar, which is why Hillary Clinton could insult both of us by not going to Wisconsin. But this woman is she just represented for us, if you're in a small town, and I married an Iowa farm boy, it's exactly the same in Iowa. You're in a small town, there's a wedding, family and friends go to the church, but then afterwards there's a party at the hall. It's going to be something like this. There's going to be lots of ladies like this. There's going to be a keg. There's going to be dancing, maybe a band. And that is Midwestern culture. And I grew up, I then lived in places like Manhattan and Orange County, which is different. And, but at that time, the Democratic Party also, there were a lot of working class people. So our position being leftists who were from a white working class background in the Midwest, there were more of us. People noticed we existed more, especially in a place like Minnesota. But then, and then the reason when I got to college, I became radicalized is because I really hated the death penalty. And so this group on campus was having meetings about the death penalty, and I went there, and it was one of those things where like, oh, do you want to do a meeting where you get to talk about your feelings on the death penalty? I'm like, yeah. And then of course they hand you a script from like the International Socialist Organization. I'm like, well, I thought I would get to give us, and you're kind of getting to spread propaganda, but my roommate, her boyfriend was, he was very desirable to the socialists because his mom was from Chile and she was in college during Pinochet. So a Chilean refugee, political refugee, that was very hot to the socialists. And then I was so oppressed. So we were both courted by the socialists. The way, I mean, at another school, like it might have been like a fraternity going after you, but we, the cell leader would take us and ply us with beer, chicken kebabs at the Grandview Grill. So that was how we were radicalized, and that was all I did is like talked about Mumia Abu-Jamal, which I kind of regret because I think he kind of did it. I don't want anybody executed, but I just was talking a lot about him being innocent, and because I liked the Black Panthers, and I don't think he was innocent. I still don't like the death penalty, so I just regret, to the police officer that he killed, like saying that he was innocent because I don't think he was. So I think that was about the most radical thing. We also protested Whole Foods, which this is like the political history of the last 30 years. So we're in St. Paul, and then we find out that, the local grocers union or whatever is like, they're closing down our union grocery, and this stupid store from Texas called Whole Foods is coming in. And so that was like polarizing because punks hate hippies, and the unions were like anti-hippie, but then there were a lot of vegetarians and like people like that. I never crossed the picket line. I never went to Whole Foods, and then I was like, I kind of regret that. I feel stupid. And now I've kind of come full circle, and I'm like, I think it was prescient, because I bet anybody in that neighborhood would rather have a regular grocery store right now than a Whole Foods. So I think we called that one right. But that was also why I liked being a socialist, because I could hang out outside protesting and smoking cigarettes, and there were punk rock boys there. So it was like, it was a really good social scene. But I think culturally it was also a point where our generation was really raised on Sesame Street and values of inclusion. So, like I said, I married an Iowa farm boy who, he was from a similar cultural town. Like, he was also Danish American, and his town had like nice libraries and schools built in the 50s, but everything was declining. And his parents had been in the Peace Corps though, and he had a worldview, and we just had access to a worldview that was a little bit bigger than other people in small towns. And but it was also a moment where in the same year I saw Public Enemy at First Avenue, and I saw Johnny Cash at Orchestra Hall. And I feel like it was a time when it made sense for people to be liking those two artists together. And I feel like poor people who identified as believing in the common man, whether you call it working class or whatever, whether it's faith-based or politically based, I just feel like there was more of a class understanding then than there is now. But I also think that, this is a very classic Marxist perspective, you would say, of more conservative people, is that conservatives try to introduce racism in order to divide the working class, because as long as they're fighting each other, they won't realize it's the bosses. That's kind of basically what it is. But I think what I was less sensitive to, and now that I see the rise of Trump and try to understand the change in the world around me, and especially in Michigan where I grew up. But even when I think now, though, of a topic like that's supposed to be so polarizing, like the Black Panther Party, like when I learned when I was like 18 the history of why these activists in Oakland started carrying around shotguns, I read, well, it's because there was an ordinance that it was legal for, because it's the Wild West, so it was legal in Oakland for anybody. It wasn't written with a racial qualification. It was legal for citizens to walk around with long guns. And so really it was political theater in a way for the Black Panthers to walk around legally with a gun. And coming from a place like Michigan where I grew up eating venison that was hunted, I didn't sympathize with the Michigan militia, but I certainly knew that there were men who like to walk around with guns and feel full of themselves. It just seems strange to me that we say that when Black men do that they're dangerous terrorists. That just seems like obvious racism. And I don't think you have to be super woke and be a communist to think that. I think most of the people where I grew up would think that if they kind of knew the history of the Black Panthers. Like, hey, people just wanted to be treated like men and women instead of animals and children. That makes sense. We always talked about using race to divide people as something that's done on the far right. And I think with the rise of far-right nationalists, I think that we need to maybe look at some of the fissures on the liberal side. Sometimes it can be really convenient. For example, if you want to sound like a very enlightened, caring, racial justice focused liberal person, just talk about reparations. And that's important. I think, for example, if your grandfather didn't get the GI Bill, I don't know why you shouldn't be able to get that, things that are easy to prove. But when it's like more like abstract, like we're just gonna like give every person who was connected to chattel slavery $200,000. We know that's never gonna happen. So by focusing sometimes on, I think, these fringe racial issues, it's a way to distract from like actually raising the taxes on the elite progressives who are talking about those things. And I think sometimes it can be really convenient if you try to carve apart poor white people from poor black people by implying one group is poor. They didn't have racism. They don't have any excuse. They're just trash. And the other group, oh, it's systemic racism is so big. So, and that's a message that you definitely get if you grew up poor and white, because people often don't realize that I grew up poor. So they say things that I don't think, they don't realize I'm in the room. So people do say things like that to me. Or say things like, I'd rather give to animals because, at least at least I want animals to be born. I don't want those people having kids. It's like, people don't hear the things that they say when they haven't been around poor people, and they have really dismissive, hateful feelings towards poor people in rural areas where they've never been. But if you're from those areas, you're very sensitive to it, and you hear it a lot, unfortunately. But even when I was in college, and it was like, I remember the first time I met trustees from my college. These are like the really rich people who keep an eye on the endowment. And my school was famous for having $1 billion endowment, and for a really small school. And I went to this luncheon because I had this scholarship, and I sat next to a trustee, and she leaned in and looked at me, and she's like, "You're the kind of student I want to see more of." And I think what she meant was smart, not somebody who needed money. Not somebody trashy, because I tried really hard to look like somebody who didn't need money. And then, when you get what you want, sometimes it's a mixed blessing. But then I would hear things like, my friend who was a socialist, so you'd think we'd know a class, like his roommate was in a class with me, and he had grown up in LA, and he was a migrant from El Salvador. And we were in a class, we were talking about, it was like the time of Custer, like the 1900s. And I said something, I don't know what, but he said, well, but there are no poor white people in America. And I was so taken aback, because he was in Minnesota. This was 98, 99. And so to not know there were, at that time, the rate of crack usage in Iowa was higher than in New York, which people didn't know unless you're married to a liberal Iowa farm boy, and so the stories began to disappear of people, a large swath of people suffering in this country. And it's something that I just always hoped that people would get around to taking care of poor people, but never seemed to make it. But it was actually, ironically, from traveling to post-communist countries that I became less radical. After I graduated, I spent a year living in England. My ex had a fellowship at the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies, so it was a pretty interesting place to live. And I taught in preschools, and we went to Poland. So this is like 2001, and being in post-communist Poland, and we had good friends who, they had grown up. It's like the stereotypes, like they literally were like have you heard of the Beatles? It's like, yeah, we've heard of the Beatles, and like they would play Hey Jude, and um, because they have been so closed off to Western culture, and there was really a sense of the social repression they'd been under. You just couldn't pretend that the way communism had worked out in these countries hadn't just really hurt people, hurt their spirit, made them angry and closed off and defeated, less civic, less engaged. It was kind of funny because my friend Łukasz, growing up in communist Poland, in Oxford, England, he was like, why do these people smile all the time? They look like idiots. And he was like, because they were so confused, because like people would smile at them and they thought that they loved them. It was like, why do these people love me so much? And they just thought the English people smiled so much. It's like, oh brother, you don't know America. Like, we smile a lot. We really smile like dipshits, but they don't in Poland. They stone-faced. And when you're a foreigner, I mean, I don't even want to speak for a foreigner. They might see threatening, but they stare at you like at that time, because they hadn't had a lot of engagement with people. So, but it was kind of interesting because since my ex was an Iowa farm boy, and we learned that Poland is basically the Iowa of Europe, Poland and Ukraine. And so culturally, there were those similarities in some way, like being kind of like the Midwestern chip on your shoulder, only the Midwestern equivalent in Europe. But I just remember talking about growing up in poverty, and I did grow up in American poverty, but Łukasz and Tamara said, did you ever see people starve? Did you ever see people's ribs go through their skin? And I did not. I mean, that is something that even now, between the private and public sector, you don't. I mean, I've lost